there was always a dangerous trap in that whole idea of the West and in the whole idea even of the liberal international order that it had to be the US that leads it.
Hello and welcome back to The Focus. Today we're joined by returning guest Professor Scott Lucas, veteran journalist, academic and analyst of US and international affairs, to talk about a world in flux. With Donald Trump back in office, the headlines are relentless. Trade wars, constitutional brinkmanship, the growing geopolitical uncertainty, these aren't just talking points, they're shaping the future of America and the world. Some say Trump is a misunderstood genius, bringing long overdue fairness to a broken system. Others warn that he's taking a chainsaw to the institutions that hold democracy together. And then there's the curious case of Elon Musk, tech titan, policy influencer, and increasingly a wild card in the Trump 47 orbit. So what's fact, what's fiction, and where does this all leave America's allies? Let's dive in. Scott, welcome back to The Focus.
Nah, thank you so much, John. It's always such a pleasure to join you and your great viewers.
Thank you. Scott, the world seems to have gone crazy. On the one side, we have pro-Trump voices touting the idea that he's a very stable genius, and that we simply have to wait for things to calm down before his genius is finally revealed. On the other side, we've got anti-Trump voices arguing that long-standing global norms on trade, politics, and strategy are going up in flames. Are these claims just exaggeration, or is the anti-Trump camp playing politics against a misunderstood leader who's simply trying to bring fairness to the world?
All right, John. So I think the daily task is, to cut through the spin, it's to cut through the propaganda, sometimes disinformation, and it's to cut through the false balance. Now, I'll give you a personal opinion of Donald Trump later in our discussion, but it's important to begin with, a realistic look at where we are.
Yeah.
And where we are is not just, I think, perhaps the greatest challenge to the US system, probably since 1865, the end of the US Civil War. I think we might be at one of those hinge moments globally where you will see perhaps the most significant changes to the global system, not just since the end of the Cold War in 1991, but since the end of World War II in 1945. So, quite often, and I understand we're going to talk about Trump, we talk about Musk, we talk about the United States. Everybody is involved in this. You could talk about where I am in Ireland, where we're facing perhaps a key moment for the Irish economy within the EU. You could talk about a key moment for Australia, because it's not just Australia's position versus the United States, it's Australia's position versus its Asian and Pacific neighbors. Where you are in terms of multilateral partnerships like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example. And then you have other bodies, which are the US-led bodies, such as the Quad, for security, and all of that is sort of in flux, right? All of that is possibly going to be taken apart, where we almost have a new economic, political, and military system, which is not one based on rules and based on institutions, but it almost turns like a kaleidoscope.
Yeah.
Almost, indeed, as we saw in the past 2 days, with just simply a tweet or an announcement from a guy who calls himself the President of the United States, and the world's stock and bond markets go like a roller coaster. Yeah, I think, in other words, let's dive deep into where you want to talk about, whether we talk about, and I'll just give you a quick tick list, the greatest challenge probably to European security since 1945, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine in its fourth year, including where the US stands on European security. Yet another, but one of the deadliest wars in the Middle East, with Israel renewing the mass killings which are taking place in Gaza, and I think will continue indefinitely. We could talk about the ongoing tension with Iran, whether that becomes a military conflict or whether Donald Trump gets a photo opportunity with the supreme leader. Not holding my breath on that one. We could talk about where we are in terms of things that people tend to forget about in all this, like probably an imminent climate change emergency,
Mm.
where we don't have that much time to try to turn things around, something you know about in Australia as well, where we can talk about global health emergencies having just come out of a pandemic less than 5 years ago. So,
Yep.
all of those occurring separately would be enough of a challenge, but all of them occurring at the same time with a real question over leadership and authority, not just in the US, but in other places as well. And that's a recipe, I think, for a new world, which may not be a new world order, but a question of whether we have to deal with new world disorder on a daily basis.
I have to ask you this question, Scott, because, the thought did cross my mind about a 2 or 3 month period ago. I mean, so
Yeah.
much has happened since January of this year. It's hard to keep up. But are we looking at the end of the West? I mean, of all the things that you've cataloged, is this now the end? I mean, America has stepped back from international leadership. Maybe it's found its historic default setting, which is isolationism, and they think that that's going to make America great again. And fair enough, maybe it will. But without the American engine driving the West, what is the West?
Well, I'm going to slightly reframe that to answer it, which may be a different way. And that's first things I've always tended to reject going into a West versus East scenario. And I want to tell you why. I rebelled against that going back to the 1990s when there's a fellow named Samuel Huntington
Mm.
who talks about clash of civilizations. And so, like, it's the whole idea that even though the Cold War has supposedly ended, we've got to be in like this perpetual conflict where either the West wins and the East loses or the West is defeated. And the reason why I thought this was nonsense, and I still do, is you look at the countries who Huntington called the West. He said, oh, well, Japan, they're part of the West because I kind of like them. But China, they're part of the East because I don't like them.
Yeah.
I think the framing here is where do we stand in our own countries and where do we stand internationally in
Mm.
terms of questions of cooperation, discussion, sometimes disagreement, but whether there's sort of rules of the games in terms of how we pursue that. So let's take it from that approach. Um, there was always a dangerous trap in that whole idea of the West and in the whole idea even of the liberal international order that it had to be the US that leads it. And here I've got to make a disclosure. I can go all the way back to the 1990s where I kicked against that. Indeed, I can remember it being, at my inaugural address, you get to give like a once in a lifetime thing when you become a professor where people have to listen to you. And I remember that I horrified the vice chancellor of the University of Birmingham by saying the United Kingdom needed to break away from the United States and stop following it. That this special relationship was dragging us down, right? Uh, I may have slightly modified my views a little bit on the U.S. since then, at least pre-Trump, but the fundamental remained that there was this default position that the US leads, everybody follows, and that's the system we're in. I never bought that. And I especially didn't buy that when that whole idea of America as the unipolar, as the world superpower, got us into the deadly catastrophe, deadly first and foremost for Iraqis, of the war in 2003,
Mm.
as well as the intervention in Afghanistan. So I always had question marks about whether we should always say, look, what's happening with the US? If the US goes this way, that's it. We're all doomed. And I think we're at one of those moments. And again, let me explain it why now in terms of 2025. Look, Donald Trump is a bully in a global China shop, to strain a cliche. And that is Trump doesn't believe in acting for American interest. He doesn't believe in acting for America's position in the world. Donald Trump believes in acting for Donald Trump. Now, that's a much different America. And you need to realize that there is no such thing as American leadership in the sense that we know it when you talk about Trump and his close advisors acting that way. So you are talking about question marks in terms of the future of NATO, in terms of the future of the United Nations, in terms of the future of partnerships with Australia. And I would include the Quad in that. I would include the Five Eyes intelligence relationship with that. Futures of international organizations from the World Health Organization to the World Trade Organization to environmental cooperation. All of that's in question. But here's the kicker. If Trump takes the US off to the side, which again is what the tariffs, that's the wider issue here, that he's taking the US into economic isolationism. If he takes it off to the sides, we don't disappear. Australia does not disappear in terms of its economy, in terms of its military, in terms of its political relationships. Canada, as we've seen quite vividly in its stance against Trump's bullying, does not disappear. The EU, one of the world's largest trading blocs, one of the world's largest political blocs, does not disappear. So rather than talking about a collapse, if the US goes to the sideline, you talk about realignments. Now, here, with eyes open, realignments includes what the position of the Russians will be, but they, of course, have tied themselves down with this ill-fated invasion of Ukraine. But realignments also includes where the Chinese go next.
Yeah.
And one thing I had to do, I had to kick against it earlier this morning on another appearance, which was someone said, "Oh, yay, the U.S. is going down. We can all look to China now." And I'm like, well, no, you don't. You don't answer one fire by jumping into another. You still get burned. And the fact is that the effect of what Trump is doing is going to be China getting an opening to try to expand its power, expand its influence. And we could talk about how they do that, but it does not mean a Chinese unipolar. That's just would be ridiculous. Nor does it mean another phrase that the Russians like to use. It doesn't mean simply, you know, you go beyond the multipolar, which is that, you just have like this complete fragmentation of power that takes place. The Russians kind of like that because that means they think no one will call them out on what they're doing. No, you will have new alignments of countries that will cooperate together. You just don't have to fall into a trap of calling it unipolar, bipolar, multipolar. You just call it being smart and being sensible about the way you pursue your economic and political interest.
But we've had a period of time where internationally, and we can't just focus on the United States here, but internationally,
Mm.
there hasn't been a great deal of statesmanship. Our political leaders are pretty clueless. They come to the party thinking that they're defending a system which now no longer exists. So, it's
But
we sit back and we talk about what we expect and how we expect things to change, but we're still talking about people who have been in that system in multiple countries. So, are they able to adapt? Will circumstances force them to do so, or will they hope against hope that somehow the American system will right itself and they don't have to do the hard work of trying to work things out?
well, let me tell you why I'm not prepared to go into the bunker and give it all up just yet. And that is, while I think this is perhaps the most serious moment for the international community since 45, we've had some really tricky ones in the recent past. After the 2008, whether you call it the Great Financial Crash, whether you call it the Great Recession, you know, go back to that moment where you had leaders, for example, at the G20 and leaders beyond the G20 who worked on an economic package to try to prevent the entire international economy from imploding. And again, just a quick reminder, we talked about perhaps the most significant move which had been made since World War II over debt relief. We talked about maintaining some type of international financial and economic cooperation, including between institutions, even as banks were crashing at that point. And you know what? Despite the ongoing effects of that, and there have been ongoing effects within countries because that recession has been felt in different ways, but the international economic system did not implode. You had cooperation to save the system at that point. You come out of the pandemic in 2021 and beyond, and the fact here is that at the gravest crisis in terms of international health in a century since the influenza after World War I, you had countries that not only developed their own approaches to it, like Australia, but they cooperated with each other. They cooperated with each other in terms of how you contain the virus. There were some who did not cooperate, weren't sensible. Again, Trump, but most people did. And importantly, they cooperated, although there were some issues with it in terms of vaccine distribution, but there was cooperation to get that vaccine rolled out for the most part. Then you go to after 22, when the Russians invade Ukraine and think they can wrap this up in just a few days and expand the threat elsewhere. And there was an international community which too slowly, still not completely, but there was enough international support for Ukraine where it didn't collapse. And you saw Australia is involved in that. It's not just countries who are in Europe. You saw countries giving aid from across the globe. So folks can get together. They can make this response. And the question I think you're really asking me is, can you make this response here in 2025 with all these issues that we talk about? And what I would tell you is I will look at certain signals. First of all, the European Union has problems within its camp. It's got a pro-Putin, pro-Trump autocrat named Viktor Orban in Hungary. It's got another wannabe autocrat who tilts towards Putin and Trump named Robert Fico in Slovakia. But for the most part, the EU is much more energized and much more. It still acts too slowly, but it's acting far more effectively than I can remember in recent years. And that is not just the question of supporting Ukraine. It's the question of getting the EU onto a better economic path, including over competitiveness, including over technology, including over investment in production, right? And it's despite Brexit, and it's in response to Brexit, which was a wake-up call to the EU. If you look at what is happening with Canada, the Canadians who have been so inextricably tied to the United States for generations in terms of their economic partnerships, in terms of their political relationships, and even their cultural relationships, are now developing new relationships. You look at the fact that Canada is talking about expanding military exchange, military trade with Australia, for example, as well as expanding economic links with Europe. And so, clearly the Canadians don't want the US to disappear, but they're looking at diversifying in terms of the approaches that they take. You talk about where Japan and South Korea are going to be looking across Asia, and I would suspect into the Pacific as well, because of what's happened with the United States. And so what you're talking about here is that not all of these responses will be effective. Not all leaders will be people that we think make the right decisions. But there will be a significant approach by many leaders, which is we want to get back to a rules of the game, which is a win-win relationship, or at least avoiding a lose-lose relationship, no matter what that guy with the orange face does in Washington, no matter what Vlad does in the Kremlin, and no matter what Xi Jinping does in Beijing as he tries to consolidate personal power across a country of more than 1 billion people.
I have to ask you this, though, Scott. I mean, you're right on all scores, but there is a glaring problem, and that is for all that international cooperation, there were losers. Those losers happen to have been in the Rust Belt states, in the United States, in Australia, in Canada, in parts of Europe. And those people now have organized themselves to support political movements that are anti-free trade, anti-cooperation. And these things aren't going to be wound up easily or simply because they believe, and I think that there may be some truth to it, they believe that those international elites, those free traders who got us to extraordinary wealth in terms of, okay, here's a piece of paper, here's a list of all the good things that we've done. And yes, we've lifted millions out of poverty, but we've impoverished a lot of people in a background. But we don't talk about those people, we'll just put them to the side. Those people had been disenfranchised by this system, and now they're
Yeah,
fighting back. It's a terrible
yeah.
thing to say. You're right, and then that's also the problem. So, is there a way in which more of a balance can be struck? I mean, if we take this Trump administration for all its unpredictability and all its I don't even know I don't even know what the right description is, but take the Trump administration as an opportunity to try to find a better balance between local needs and international pragmatism. Is that
Yeah.
something that we could look at this period as a readjustment
If
of
that's what
sorts?
the if that's what the Trump administration was doing, which was
Mm,
to look at the domestic in relation to the international, yeah, I'm all for that. That's what every country should do. But
yeah.
again, we need to react to what is a critical situation by establishing the reality which takes place. And the reality here is that the Trump administration, uh, while they may sloganeer about the fact about make America great again, are not pursuing a joined up policy which is dealing with the fundamental problems that America faces domestically.
Mm,
Um, you have to almost take this from the ground up on various approaches, but let's talk about it. For example, America has had a long time issue regarding manufacturing. And the long time issue regarding manufacturing is that America In a changing global economy where manufacturing was developing in different parts of the world, they lost their advantage. Now, why did they lose their advantage? They lost their advantage in part because labor cost and production cost were much higher than in other parts of the world. And you have to recognize that that was the case. But they also lost their power advantage because manufacturers did not innovate in certain cases. So the American car industry, and I just say this from remembering growing up in the 70s, while we were still driving our big gas guzzling cars and making big gas guzzling cars, other parts of the world were driving smaller cars and driving fuel efficient cars because we were in an energy crisis. And with other parts of the world, because we're in a climate crisis, adopted emission standards to deal with that. The Americans did not. That's a root cause. American pharmaceuticals, the problem is that the profit margins were so great amongst American pharmaceuticals that even when American drug companies, when you had American generic drug companies that began to develop and so on, when the profit margins dropped for pharmaceuticals, the generics could no longer sustain their operations. And that's why you have pharmaceutical companies in places like Ireland and in places like India that continue to function. It's a notion of comparative advantage in terms of trade, because where the Americans have advantages is they have advantages in services and in technology, right? And we can talk about that. But that's not what the Trump people tell you. The Trump people don't give you that sensible approach to it. They just simply say the rest of the world is ripping us off. So they're not pursuing a balance between the domestic and the international. What they're pursuing is effectively a win-lose relationship, which is that we have to make sure that others suffer so you gain. And if that doesn't happen, we're going to pursue economic isolationism, which, by the way, did not work in the 1930s. It didn't work with the international tariffs led by the US at that point, and it didn't work for certain countries like Germany when they pursued autarky. Right. So, and if you want me to really give a stinger to wind some of your viewers up, you want to know the administration that did pursue that balance between the domestic and the international? It was the Biden administration.
Yeah.
The Biden administration. The Biden administration is the one that passed the coronavirus relief package, which was to try to provide a stimulus to American business coming out of the pandemic. It was the one that passed the infrastructure bill to deal with those fundamentals that we talk about, which is, do you have a decent transport system? Do you have a decent energy network? Do you have decent broadband? Can you support businesses that way? It was the one that passed the slimmed down version of what was called Build Back Better, with measures for a green economy and all of that, and there were issues with that. Some economists say they spent too much money on that. That added to the federal government deficit. That added to inflationary pressure. I take that on board, but you could see what they were trying to do. They didn't walk the US out of international organizations when that took place. Guess who has unwound the Infrastructure Act, who has unwound the CHIPS Act for investment in American technology, who has unwound Build Back Better? And you know who's done that? It's the Trump administrations. These guys are not here to establish a productive way as an alternative to what's been taking place. They're here to hold up the slogan of the globalists are evil as they try to loot and burn the place. Take it to Australia. We could go again and talk about where are Australia's problems. Australia's do have issues regarding labor markets. They've got issues regarding manufacturing. They've got questions between the balance between climate and economic activity. These are huge challenges for a government to take place. I don't think the Australian government has ever gotten it right. But you know what I don't hear the Australian government doing? I don't hear the Australian government doing saying, we're going to slap a tariff of 20, 30, 40, 50, 125% on everybody else because we've got our domestic problems. And this is the way that we're going to shift the blame and possibly get a bit of money from someone else to bail us out. I don't see them doing it that way.
Scott, not yet. I mean, we are in an election.
I can't see Albanese going that way, and I'm not sure what Scotty Morrison's up to now. But I don't think he could pull that gambit off if he tried to come back. All right.
Well, the guy that's leading the Liberal National Coalition, our opposition, Peter Dutton. I mean, he's been selling himself as the Trump light guy. So because we've got a bunch of people here in Australia who really do believe that the Trump experiment is what we need and it's working. And what really kind of gets to me is
Yeah.
there are all sorts of justifications being bandied around. And I caught up with some friends of mine this morning. We were having a
Uh,
discussion about. I said, "Well, I heard somewhere along the lines, and one of our members is, he's a stately gentleman of a certain age." And I said, "Well,
uh,
look, you've been around, when Nixon was around." And
uh,
someone said that, hey, listen, you think you've seen some terrible thing right now with Donald Trump, but don't worry, it was just as chaotic under Nixon when he moved the Americans away from the gold standard. And look, I was too young at the time. I think I was about, what, 3 or something. So I didn't really have my head in the game, but I did read all the books as I grew up. And
yeah.
I kind of understood that the history of the Nixon administration, Nixon still obeyed some form of law. I mean, he tried to find out ways in which he could circumvent bits of the Constitution and try to, what's the word I'm looking for? Get his interests forward, but not in such an overt
Yeah.
fashion, and certainly not as chaotic.
Yeah.
But I mean,
Yeah, and the system caught up with them. I mean, the
yeah.
system caught up with them, of course,
Well,
in
that's
terms of
right.
culpability over Watergate. But
Yeah.
the system, in a way, as it were, the global system caught up with him in terms of what happened towards the later part of his administration. When you talk about the energy shock, when you talk about OPEC handling prices, and it was like this whole idea that America, because of the Vietnam War and all the turmoil that it caused, that it could set the rules and do this. Nixon got his comeuppance before that.
Mm,
Um, I I think to bring it back to Australia, though, and this is where I would learn from you and your viewers, you talk about what Peter Dutton does and so on.
mm,
The whole issue for someone that wants to pretend to be a Trump light or do it is what happens when the rubber hits the road when you come into power,
mm,
right? Now,
yeah.
Canada, which is not quite the same example, but I'll give you, where the Trump light approach gets exposed. Uh, Pierre Poilievre, who was the leader of the Conservative Party there and who was hoping to capitalize on what looked to be the demise of the Liberals under Justin Trudeau.
Mm,
He was doing all the Trump talk, right? And also, and then, of course, what happens is Trump starts shouting that Canada should be the 51st state and slaps the
yeah.
tariffs on the Canadians. And now
Mm,
the Canadians are like all elbows up because of Canadian nationalism. And that, the Liberals are in a good shape to hold on to power
mm,
under Mark Carney because he's an adult in the room.
yeah.
Carney's former chair of the Bank of England. Now you go to somewhere like Australia, so Peter Dutton can talk this talk here. But the first thing is whether you're going to get shockwaves from Trump, because I think you fellas who have no tariffs on American products,
Mm,
right? Who have no massive trade surplus with the United States in goods, let alone services. You still got 10% on you,
yeah.
right? It's like and so like okay, it'll be interesting to see how Dutton spends that as to
Mhm,
whether he
mhm,
supports Trump being. But beyond that, you have a question which is what Trump has brought into focus are serious questions within countries, which is how do we manage our infrastructure? How do we manage our manufacturing capacity? How do we manage our agriculture? Especially with Trump shouting at the Australians that you don't take in US beef and pork, which means you're ripping us off. Spoiler alert, no, it doesn't. And I can tell you that that story, and I can tell it to the listeners if you want to.
yeah.
And what happens here is that when this happens, either because of what Trump does or when a Trump light politician comes into power, they can no longer rely on the slogans and the social media. They've actually got to address the day-to-day issues. They've got to
Yeah.
address the valence issues. And with the exception, the partial exception so far of Javier Milei in Argentina, which
Mm,
is an interesting case to watch, I can't think of a Trump light leader who has come out and done it effectively. Bolsonaro did not do it effectively in Brazil.
mhm,
Orban is sheltered in Hungary because of the EU. Otherwise, Hungary would be in serious trouble by the
yeah.
way that he's playing this. Um, you know, it. I think this whole and Maloney in Italy. I take this back here. Let me give you another example. Georgia Maloney is a far right leader
Mhm,
in some of her ideology, but she did two things that are distinctive. One is she never came up and modeled herself as Trump light. She was Italian through and through. And secondly, Georgia Maloney, when she's come into power, has tacked very pragmatically, especially with her relationships with the EU. She's still very hard right or even far right on immigration. But in terms of economic policy, manufacturing policy, and European security policy, she arguably is in the mainstream. with
Hmm.
the Europeans. So I don't want to be too optimistic here, but at the end of the day, uh, yeah, pragmatism trumps, all pun intended, pragmatism trumps tweets.
Okay, so let's turn to another burning issue, the US Constitution. There's been a lot of talk about
Mm.
Trump's threat to the US Constitution. Can you brief our audience what specifically has occurred under Trump 47 that leads you to believe that this threat is real? And playing devil's advocate, could this just be a bleeding heart liberal view? I mean, or is there objective fact to back it up? I mean, well, what are we seeing here?
Yeah, at the risk of my bleeding heart being called out here, let's go back to what has happened since January 20th, which you talk about it. And again, it comes back to what we just talked about, which is,
Yeah.
do you have a government which is pragmatic? Do you have a government which is competent? Do you have a government which is effective on a day-to-day basis? So Trump and his unelected co-president, Chainsaw Elon, they have come in and from the get-go, they stole the records, and it was theft. They stole the records of most government agencies. They began with the US Treasury. They stole documents covering trillions of dollars of payments, whether it goes to individuals in terms of their health care, whether it goes to individuals in terms of support payments, welfare payments elsewhere, whether it goes to contractors who do work for the government. They went in, they stole the records. They stole those records, although there hasn't been a criminal finding yet, because the young men who went in there, almost all between 19 and 26, went in there without security clearance, went in it without legal or constitutional authority, and they just stole the records.
Mhm.
Some of these agencies that they went into, they then started to proceed to fire the staff. Thousands of people were fired, or they called for mass resignations, notably through Elon Musk one word resign
Mhm.
tweet on X. Uh, when people would not resign, some of them were then fired. When there were high level officials who tried to stop the thefts of the documents or who did not carry out the firings, they too were fired. The heads of oversight for multiple boards, like the Labor Relations Boards, like the Security Exchange Commission, like the Federal Trade Commission, were fired.
Mhm.
Uh, Entire departments have been wound up. In terms of U.S. soft power and humanitarian programs, the U.S. Agency for International Development. In terms of domestically, the Department of Education responsible for maintaining and overseeing civil rights in education, responsible for supporting disabled students, responsible for the student loans program to
Mhm.
provide access to higher education, and for numerous other programs as well. They just went through and just got rid of them, right? Uh, there has been an effective suspension on government research in key areas. There's almost no government research being carried out on environmental issues now. There's almost no government research on health issues. There's certainly no government research which involves international cooperation. Uh, any type of research which is on diversity, issues of diversity or equity, and you could simply be talking about research into history. You could talk about research in terms of healthcare amongst ethnic and racial communities. That is stopped. That is halted. The heads of the U.S. military have been fired. Heads of the Joint Chief of Staff, head of the Coast Guard's been fired. Three-star generals, other admirals dismissed, in some cases, simply because they were women. Now, you can tick off all of this and keep going. What you have is a government which risks not being fit for purpose. Because how do you continue to deliver Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid when you don't have the staff to do it, when your records have been compromised and take place? So I'm not rambling on too long. Then let me go to the higher issue, and that is the US government. And you know the shorthand for it. I learned it ever since I was a boy. It relies on the notion of checks and balances.
Mhm.
For all the flaws in the US system, and we could talk about them in practice, that system has served the US well for almost 250 years as it has developed. For checks and balances to work, you have to have a respect, not only for US agencies, but have to respect for Congress, you have to have a respect for the judiciary. As it guts the agencies, as the Trump administration is trying to undermine the judiciary, they are trying to pack courts with judges who simply will follow their will. When there are judges who issue rulings against them, they call them out on social media and they threaten them. They threaten them with punitive action and they call on their followers to harass them. Uh, there have been certain cases where they have avoided judicial decisions in what are clearly acts that may be illegal, such as the deportation, mass deportation of migrants without any evidence. And by the way, all these Venezuelans have been deported. The evidence has not been produced to show that they are members of a gang threatening U.S. security. They have been deported instead because of guidelines that we have seen, because of the type of tattoos that they have, or because of the way that they dress. Uh, the courts have been handcuffed so far from preventing those deportations because the government says they're already in El Salvador in these effectively warehouses. These warehouses, overcrowded warehouses of detainees. So how are you going to get them back? Uh, you have an entire attempt. You have an attempt to eliminate an entire section of Americans who identify as transgender by giving them no legal rights whatsoever, by giving them no social rights whatsoever. We can debate the trans issue. It's a very complicated issue, but the Trump approach has been to ban them entirely. That is a serious assault on civil rights. And you have an assault on civil rights in the name of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, by effectively firing people or preventing them from acting because of their skin color, because of their ethnicity, because of their religious affiliation. That is where the U.S. is. In the shorthand, I'll speak to you personally. The country where, even though I've lived outside of it for 40 years, I still had ties to that country in terms of that it would aspire to provide opportunity. It would aspire to provide equality. It would aspire to provide the rule of law. That is still my country, but that is not the government in charge of this country. That government is not an American government in terms of the way that I know America. And we need to be very clear about that. If you support what Trump's doing, fine. You have your reasons for that. But let us be honest here. What Project 2025 set out, what Elon Musk has implemented, what Donald Trump is promoting is an attempt to gut the American system to establish an autocracy. That is what it is at its core.
Okay. I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. And from Ireland, we're speaking with Scott Lucas, journalist, emeritus professor, and associate of the Clinton Institute, University College in Dublin. Wow, that was a pretty devastating thing that you've just said, but now let's get into the weeds of Liberation Day, shall we? You've said on Times Radio, I believe, that Trump's claims that foreign governments were exploiting free trade and ripping off the US are false. Can you walk our audience through where the current president gets it so wrong?
They're not just false.
I'm trying to walk the fine line here, Scott.
No fine line. I mean, they're illiterate. They're barking. They're absolutely barking. And I'm sorry, I will answer this as an analyst in a minute, but I'm just going to take you into that moment, which is, God knows, it's only a week ago, 8 days ago as we speak. And he shows up in the Rose Garden, right? And he's got all the clapping seals there. He's got all the staff, you have to clap. He's got all the cabinet members that have to clap. And he goes, give me that chart, Howard. The guy who's the Commerce Secretary, that is, give me that chart. And he holds up that list of numbers. And I'm like trying to scroll down who's been listed there. And I'm going, okay. And full disclosure, I mean, I did, some people may not believe it, but I did a degree in economics, and it's still part of my work as an analyst. So I'm going down that and I'm going, okay. China apparently has a 64% tariff on U.S. products. So we're going to put, 68%. So we're going to put 34% on them and something like that. Okay, fine. And then he goes, EU, 39% tariff. So we're going to put 20% tariffs on them. And Japan, 46%. We're going to slap 26% on. Just kind of Lesotho, God, what did they do to hurt you so bad, right? They apparently have 100% tariff on U.S. products, so they're going to get hit with 50%. And I'm going, that makes absolutely no sense. And it makes no sense. And I have to explain it because, and I double checked the figures. we already talked about how Australia, which has no tariff on US products, they get 10% along with everybody else, simply because Trump says, I'm just going to take money from everybody, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
In the name of reciprocity. Uh, the EU weighted average tariff on American products in 2024 was 1%. There were some
Okay.
products where it was higher than 1%, but there were others where it was lower than 1%. Not according to that chart. The Japan weighted average between 3.5% to 4%, not
Mm.
46%. Cambodia, which got hit with a 46 to 49% tariff because they supposedly had a 95% tariff on US products. Cambodia, even though it has certain high tariffs of 35% on certain products to try to encourage its local industry, the weighted average is about between 9 and 10%. The highest tariff on US products, I think, is India, which is
Hmm.
around about 11 to 12. Okay? That's
Yeah.
it. So where did that chart come from? Where did that chart come from? These madmen, I swear to God, they come out. And what they do is they say, okay, we're going to take the total, if there's a trade deficit in goods, right? So the US has a trade deficit in goods, hypothetically, not with Australia because you don't have that, but with the EU. We're going to take that trade deficit and we're going to divide it by the total number of imports from that country into the United States. And that becomes the tariff, right? First of all, that's nonsense. That's not a tariff. That simply is American people buying more goods from a country than they sell to that country. That is a choice. Americans choose to buy more goods from the European Union than they sell to the European Union. Okay. But secondly, uh, it does not account for the fact that the United States runs a surplus in services to many parts of the world. And indeed, Ireland, where I'm speaking to you from right now, the US has a trade surplus of 93 billion euros with Ireland. Does that mean we escape the 20% tariff on the EU? It does not, right?
Mm.
So they just came up with this formula which made more sense. Then the economist who they claim gave them the formula says, even if you apply the formula, they got it wrong by a factor of 300%. They should have only applied 1/4 of the tariff levels that they applied. The formula they used was wrong. So, in other words, these were guys that just scribbled something down on a piece of paper, right?
Hmm.
Then, by the way, let's just tell the story, and you folks know it, but I'm going to tell it. Then they said, well, who are we going to apply the tariffs to? Who are we going to apply the tariffs to? All right, oh, got our magic formula. But then there's these other countries, and we may not have a huge trade deficit with them, but we want to give them all tariffs as well. Australia, you get the tariffs. And then they get down to the Hurdy McDonald Islands, and you know where I'm
Right.
going with this. And they go, there's something called the Hurdy McDonald Islands, 10% on them as well. And I'm going, okay, you guys didn't check out the fact that there have only been 2 recorded visits, I believe, by humans to this island, and that the only production coming out of those islands would be whatever basically penguins are leaving behind. So if you want to,
Mm.
let's just call it, put 10% tariffs on pigeon shit, or sorry, penguin shit, go ahead, boys. You know, and it's and it wasn't just the Herd McDonald Islands as well. There were some other islands as well. Had absolutely the Falklands Islands, bless them. Remember when
Oh, yes.
Liberation Day meant liberating the Falklands in the 80s? The Falkland Islands got hit with a 41% tariff, right? And it's
It's all
like
those sheep.
Argentina,
Oh, yeah.
although Argentina got hit with a much lower tariff, and I bet all the Falkland Islanders are going, Jesus, if only we'd let ourselves be conquered in the 80s, we would have been economically liberate. You know, all of this is barking mad. That's just stage one, though, John. If you're right. Then
Mm.
the Trump administration comes saying, "Oh no, we didn't mean tariffs. We didn't mean that we were getting hit by tariffs. We were getting hit by non-tariff measures. That's how we were getting ripped off, right?
Right.
That other
Right.
countries were stacking the debt. Okay, what do you mean by non-tariff measures? I bless his heart. Donald Trump, in that barking mad speech, starts coming out with all kinds of stuff, right, about non-tariff measures. He said, okay, they don't take our cars in Germany. And Trump said this for a long time, remembering that last October he proposed a 20,000% tariff on German cars. right?
I
Now, I don't
mean,
know how that would have worked. 20,000%. I'm going, so anyway, what do you mean they don't take US cars? US cars are not banned in Germany. I mean, the Germans, learning from history, be careful in terms of exactly what they ban. What happens here is Germans don't buy a lot of American cars because American cars don't meet the emission standards set by Germany as part of the European Union. And Germans tend to drive much smaller cars than a lot of US makes. Straightforward.
yep.
You're not making the cars that fit their market, they don't get sold. So
You
you can
won't get
put
too
all the
many Dodge
tariffs,
Rams. Dodge
you won't,
Rams
yeah,
on a
Dodge,
German
yeah,
street, forget it.
yeah,
It'll just
yeah,
wedge
you won't get
itself.
that.
Yeah, forget
Yeah,
it.
exactly. Exactly. You're just gonna be stuck between all those small cars, right? And not able to shift.
Yeah.
So, then he says, oh, Australia. Australia. I think actually it was the UK, but we'll apply it to Australia as well. The UK and the EU, they don't take our chicken. They don't take our chicken. And I'm going, yeah, they don't take your chicken because your chicken are washed in chlorine, and we've known this for years, and it doesn't meet the standards. And you tried to get the UK to give up those standards in Trump 1.0, and they didn't do it. Bless their
Mm.
hearts. Then they don't take our beef and they don't take our pork. And here's where I learned about Australia. Australia doesn't take your beef, not just because of the legacy of mad cow disease, but they agreed a few years ago to take your beef, but then they said, we're only going to take beef under our national regulations, which has been born and reared in the US. Because a lot of American beef is brought in from Canada, or American cows are brought in from Canada and Mexico and reared in the United States. You're going to have to certify those animals as well coming from other countries. And the Americans have never bothered to do it. That's
Right.
why they don't have beef going into Australia.
Yep.
Same, so I could go through all these non-tariff barriers, but they're sitting there representing this as part of this unequal trade system that goes out
Mm.
there. And the upshot of it is that what would have been a realistic approach to trade and to these issues of manufacturing that we talk about. So let's talk about what would have been realistic. First of all, globally,
Mm.
there's something called the World Trade Organization.
Yep.
You got a grievance with another country, you go to the WTO. And the Americans do have legitimate grievances, I think, with Chinese. Arguably, they may have a grievance with the Indians, maybe have with the Japanese on certain American products, but you go to the WTO, right?
Mm.
Now, why won't the Trump folks go to the WTO? Because they don't recognize the legitimacy of the WTO. They, in fact, have stood in the way of appointing regulators to the WTO for the WTO's effectively judicial procedure, where
Mm.
it is compromised in the way that it can operate.
Yep.
If you've got an issue with China, you do what you do in Trump 1.0. You go into trade talks with the Chinese. And remember, he reached a deal with the Chinese in 1.0. So why don't you do it again? And the answer to this is that the Trump folks weren't interested in playing by the rules of the game here. And here, I know I'll watch the clock, but if you forgive me, I need to give you a couple minutes of explanation in terms of where we are
Oh,
now as I
please.
speak to you,
Absolutely.
especially given Trump's partial retreat, which is I'm such a great deal maker. I'm now going to reduce all the proposed tariffs to 10% on all the
Mm.
countries that I slapped 30, 40, 50% on. And then China, I'll just pick a number 125. There are two camps within the Trump administration. There is one camp who believe that yes, we would like to renegotiate trade agreements and we can use tariffs as a lever.
Yep.
Uh, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is there. The chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Kevin Hassett, belong to that camp, right? The other
Right.
camp just want to rip the whole system apart. Peter Navarro, who was in prison this time last year, fun fact, for contempt of Congress. Peter Navarro, the Stephen Miller, the highly xenophobic Stephen Miller, and the U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer. And their idea is simply we just burn it all down. We burn the global system down and we negotiate one-on-one with countries and not negotiate. We effectively make demands of them
Mm.
and they comply with our demands. So In the first few days after the Trump announcement last week, it was, let's call them the warrior protectionist. That's their plan that's brought out. They're the ones behind the magic chart with all those crazy numbers. And then the stock market, of course, doesn't like it very much, and it tanks on Thursday and Friday. Over the weekend, those folks who are more cautious, and that's a relative term with the Trump folks, but more cautious, people like Scott Bessent and Kevin Hassett, think we're going to have to recalibrate this, right? And so on Monday, Kevin Hassett went on Fox, I think it was Fox Business, and he's the one that first mentioned the 90-day pause in the tariffs, right? The U.S. markets shot up, if you remember, like 4%, 4 or 5% immediately on that. And then the White House walked it back. So, oh, no, that's been misinterpreted. No, he didn't say that. What happened here is Kevin Hassett went out and tabled, which was the readjustment. And then the warrior protectionist said, no negotiations. That's exactly what Peter Navarro said. No negotiations. And then even as late as Tuesday, Trump is telling the Republican National Committee, yeah, every country in the world is going to kiss my ass. Every country in the world is going to kiss my ass, right? And then what happened on Tuesday night, the tipping point, because we get back to pragmatism, reality. That's where we always have to get to these, is that it wasn't just that the stock market was dropping, it was the bond markets. Bond markets are arguably even more important because if a government wants to finance its debts, and the United States has $36 trillion in debt, you got to have bonds to do it. And that means you got to have people willing to buy bonds. Because if people aren't willing to buy bonds, the price you have to pay for the bonds, what's called the yield, or effectively the interest rate, shoots up, right? And Japan was trying to offload its US government bonds on Tuesday night, and it could not find a buyer for them. That's how bad it got. Normally, when the stock market drops, bonds are a safe haven. You come out of stocks, you go into bonds. And what the folks in the Trump administration, at least the adults in the room, were finding is nobody wants our bonds now. If nobody wants our bonds, we can't finance our debt. Can't finance our debt, we no longer have a value, but we no longer can maintain a credit rating. And we can no longer maintain the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Now, I'm not saying it was quite at meltdown point at that point, but it could have gotten to that point. Wednesday morning, folks go in, talk to Trump. We know that Scott Bessent was one of them because he's said he was in the meeting, he was in the room when Trump made the decision. And they push back the warrior protectionist. They say, you issue the 90-day pause. That's why you have not heard a peep from Peter Navarro since this decision was announced. His wing has been eclipsed. The U.S. Trade Representative, Jameson Greer, another warrior protectionist, he was in Congress testifying yesterday. And they said, oh, by the way, Donald Trump has just announced a 90-day pause in tariffs. Greer didn't know about it. He wasn't informed of the decision before it happened, right? So there's this huge infighting that's going on. But let me give you a stinger on this. Do you know who profited from all of that? Folks who know Donald Trump really well. So let me give you like an extra filler story you can put out on social.
Great.
Even as Trump is facing this humiliation over Liberation Day, even as he's facing it, he's calculating. At 9:37 a.m. Washington time, he puts out a tweet, and all that tweet on Truth Social says is, now is a great time to buy DJT, all caps. He usually doesn't sign his tweets DJT. DJT is basically the three-letter label for his stock market listing on the NASDAQ exchange for his social media company. Now is a great time to buy DJT. Now, maybe he just thought it's a great time to buy, everybody should support the market, or maybe he's tipping off people. Something going to happen here because 4 hours later, just after 1 p.m. Washington time, he makes the announcement. Shares in DJT, Trump's media company, went up 21.7% yesterday. So if you anticipated what was going to happen if you read that tweet, and guess what was going to happen? Well, there you go. Donald Trump may have engaged in effectively insider information, market sensitive insider information, which if you or I did it would be illegal. And so even today, as we talk about it, you're going to have some people who made a lot of money yesterday and still think Trump's great because they can ride the chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the reality is a lot of us can't ride the chaos. If you have a pension fund in the United States, you can't ride the chaos. If you don't have that enough money for stock, well, to get by day to day, let alone stocks, you can't ride the chaos. And where we are now, the position is, remember that the tariffs are still there. You guys are still paying 10. We're not only paying 10, we're paying 25 on, you got a 25% tariff on steel and
So,
aluminum.
so have we. So have we. So
Oh,
it's
that's right.
10 plus
Yeah, that's
25.
right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
10
yeah.
plus 25 that you got
Yeah,
there, right? And of course, we've
yeah,
got, that's right. Steel and aluminum's on everybody. The EU
yeah.
has also got it on cars now as well.
Mm,
So the fact here is that, he still could turn around tomorrow and put tariffs on something else. In
yeah.
Ireland, we're looking at whether he hits the pharma industry.
Mm.
So, and that to go all the way back to your question, which is, can you find a rational way to explain what he did, in which would be like that this was economically sensible? And I should have just reduced the last 10 minutes to no, there
Ah,
isn't. There isn't. And I'm going to say something else. Just look, let's get the hits driven up on social media. And let's read it.
yeah.
What Trump is very good at is Trump is very good at bullying people.
Yes.
That's what Trump does. He bullies people, and he is street smart in how to bully people, right? He is not smart when it comes to things like economics. And don't give me that successful businessman crap, because he's gone bankrupt 6 times. He's not smart in terms of the way that economics works, but it doesn't matter if he can keep bullying people. The
Mm,
upshot out of all this, I'll give you a brief answer, then the wider one. The brief answer is he's a bully who got punched in the nose. Canada punched him in the nose, uh, and did not back down. Mexico punched him in the nose. Uh, China is punching back, and so is the EU. And
mm,
that's why Trump is having to recalibrate, because he's not thinking through this in terms of an economically sensible way to approach. But the wider issue here is, it comes back to what we started off with. The entire world economic system, there's a question of where it goes next. Do you simply ride out the next 3.5 years of Trump? Or do you watch as the Chinese in particular try to create an alternative economic system where they go to countries like Lesotho? Do you really want to pay 50% tariffs, uh, on your goods? They go to a country, sorry, have 50% tariffs imposed on your goods. They do go to a country like Cambodia. Do you want those tariffs imposed on your goods? You should be trading with us. You should be exporting to us, and you should take our goods in exchange, right? And the fact here is that the Chinese at this point, the reason why they are not part of the global economic system is because they have a currency that is not internationally recognized. The RMB is not internationally recognized. The dollar is the world's currency. If the dollar stops being the world's currency, that bottom line, that foundation is gone. And where we go in terms of Europe's relations with China, Australia, other countries, New World Order, stroke disorder.
Well,
And yeah,
you
that's
know,
what Donald Trump brought.
Scott, I was going to say, for years, Premier Xi Jinping in China has been relatively isolated. Economically, it's always been central because it's the workshop of the world, but politically and strategically, it's always been on the periphery because we just don't see eye to eye with them. But now we're seeing key US partners in Asia, like Japan and South Korea, openly talking about sitting down with Beijing and coordinating their response to the Trump tariffs. I mean,
Yeah.
how significant do you think this shift is? And is America's balance of power in Asia now tilting toward its chief rival? And what might this mean for Taiwan, you think?
Yeah. Well, Taiwan's in some serious issues, got some serious issues going on now. Because, the fact here is that they were already watching what Trump administration was doing in terms of withdrawing from commitments. And one of them was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? Because if the US is withdrawing from European security, they think, is the US going to withdraw from Asian security as well? I don't think that's the case because I think a lot of Trump administration people would like to have a crack at China. But economically, what happened here is, and this is one of those bizarre stories, Donald Trump effectively recognized Taiwan as an independent country just over a week ago when he
Right.
put him on the chart, right? It's
Yep.
like, oh,
Yep.
okay.
Yep.
I'm sure the
Yep.
Chinese were thrilled about that. But here he is. He's going to, he's going, yeah, Taiwan, they put a tariff of 64% on our products. So we'll hit them with 32, and what Taiwan's like, well, wait a minute. Okay. Beyond the fact that you called us an independent country and we may get some backlash over that, you're now going to hit our economy when we're trying to maintain it versus, the big guy next door, which is why Taiwan's very quickly responded by saying, we want to negotiate this. We want to get to a 0-for-0 deal, which, by the way, the EU has been trying to get for weeks with the Trump folks. So Taiwan's trying to get that. But right now, we don't know if they're organized enough to negotiate with Taiwan, right? And by the way, just to further expose the whole myth about the great deal maker, remember what the Trump people are now talking about is if more than 70 countries have approached them, if that has happened, they're talking about negotiating more than 70 individual trade deals.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know how long it takes to negotiate a trade deal with one country? Right. So anyway, so Taiwan is sitting there. Taiwan's, but more broadly in terms of where we are regarding Asia, even if South Korea has backed away from that position that we might work with the Chinese, they're now saying we're going to send a delegation out to the United States. The Japanese are saying the same thing. The fact that it would even be broached as a possibility tells you how things are changed here. Because also remember that even before these tariffs come in, Donald Trump has threatened to withdraw US military support from South Korea. He did that in Trump 1.0, right? So you cannot assume anything with this. The big country, the biggest of them, of course, apart from China, was India. And what we were on the verge of is that Trump was talking about not only slapping a fairly significant tariff, I think 26% on India, he was talking about a tariff on pharmaceuticals. Now, India is one of the world's largest producers of pharmaceuticals. They were going to get, so they start putting out the signal a couple of days ago, we're going to talk to the Chinese, right? And that, of course, as you all know, in Australia, completely changes the dynamic in terms of where we are in recent years. Vis-a-vis how you position India versus China. So yeah, the fact here is that if it's one thing if you want to rip up the international order to try to benefit yourself nationally, but don't expect other countries to simply not do anything about it. And that's where the prospect of China trying to expand influence comes into play.
Okay, so another couple of questions and then we'll wrap up. But there's been
Mm,
talk that Elon Musk may take his proverbial chainsaw and return to administer his, dare we say, ailing businesses, particularly
yeah.
Tesla. What can you say about Musk's influence on Trump 47 thus far, and how enduring is the Trump-Musk partnership likely to be?
But they're codependents in a relationship which may be fractious. What do you do when you put two narcissists in a room with each other? Well, you're going to get a
We'll find out.
competition to out. Yeah, you'll find out. But the fact of the matter is that there's a codependence in the fact that Trump needed Musk to go in and rip up the U.S. government because Trump 1.0 couldn't do that. He couldn't do that because the court said, no, you can't do certain things. They put limits on him. The agencies fought back and so on. This time, Musk brought his boys in so quickly, they could just simply shoot the place up within a few days. Trump needs Musk on social media, or has needed him on social media, to try to tilt everything towards misinformation, disinformation,
Mhm.
to give him political cover and backing. And that's still the case. The reason why the flutter came up that Trump was going to get rid of Musk, there were two reasons here. One is that there is division between Musk and other Trump advisors. So specifically on tariffs, what was happening is that Musk was lined up with the camp that was much more, let's call it cautious, versus the warrior protectionist. And that simply is because Elon Musk, about a third of the components for Teslas are made overseas. And a lot of them are made in China. So, if you get if you get a tariff war with the Chinese, Elon's going to pay a lot more on components for his Teslas. And that's why in recent days, he and Peter Navarro, the warrior protectionist, have been having a playground spat. I mean, certain words I can't even use that Musk is, but the one I can use is that, what is it that Musk says Navarro is dumb as a box of bricks, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and and it's like, really? These are the guys leading the US government. Uh, so there was that battle which was going on, but there was another thing which was fundamentally, which was the illusion that Elon had some type of legitimacy as a special government employee. That evaporates at the end of May because you can only serve as a special government employee for 130 days.
right.
So sooner or later, you're going to have to expose the fiction that is, oh, well, he's got no authority whatsoever to lead the department, which is not a department, the Department of
Mm-hmm.
Government Efficiency. So there's both pragmatic reason here, and there's also like some tensions within the administration. But no, as long as Musk is giving Trump his backing, generally, he's an asset for Trump, and will continue to do so. Uh, and let's face where we are today. That Elon will be celebrating the fact he'll be partially celebrating the fact that Trump has made this climb down on tariffs, and then watching what Trump does in terms of the tariff war with China.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and unless Elon calls out Trump specifically on that tariff war with China, he stays.
Wow, that's a bold prediction. Okay, final one, Scott, and that is, in your opinion, and after all the things that you've said, and we're
Mm.
still going through the process, is there any coming back for the United States? Will the United States be able to find its center again? Or do you think things have gone too far, too fast? Everything's been thrown up in the air, and whatever lands on the ground is just going to be so fundamentally broken that whatever happens after Trump, it won't it won't be the United States like we understood it to be. It'll be something else.
Of course, there's a way back. Of course, there's a way back. There's a way back because there are good Americans out there who want the same thing that good Australians want or that good people in Ireland want. And that is they want they want a system which operates to give them health care and it gives them education and it gives them transport and where they have jobs and where their kids can grow up safe and one day be successful. That's what everybody wants, right? And America, with all its flaws in the past, has provided that opportunity for a lot of people,
Yep.
right? Martin Luther King's statement in the 60s about the long arc of history, right?
Mm.
You know, the issue here is not that we haven't seen America make steps on the long arc of history. It's just that it's not a straightforward path, right? Now, in the 1970s, America faced what some could have called an existential crisis out of Vietnam, out of Watergate, out of, its worst economic position since the 1930s,
Mhm.
came out of it, right? America uh, faced a huge tumult in the first few years of the 21st century, 9/11 through Iraq, through Afghanistan, through the Great Recession, came out of it. I think it had a Obama administration, which did some good things, right, that we could talk about. It survived Trump 1.0. It survived coronavirus. It had a Biden administration, which did some good things. So, yeah, it can survive Trump 2.0, even if this is the greatest threat it's faced so far.
Mhm.
But do enough Americans want that? I mean, do enough Americans want that on a daily basis that they're going to stand up to Trump and say, no, this is not, we don't pay homage to you as a king. We don't pay tribute to you as an autocrat. Uh, we have a system which we think may be flawed, but we recognize that it is our system. I don't know if enough Americans will stand up for that, but it's certainly, I'm not going to give up hope that it's there. I mean, I'll give you one story and then we'll go, and I'll give you one story. And I will not name the person involved, but someone very close to me, which does both the up and the downside. This person's one of the most decent people I know. His family, entire family, absolutely decent. Um, this whole thing of we want a decent healthcare system. We want gun control that protects our kids. We want a fair American system. They've been active in trying to pursue that. I get a message from them yesterday, and it's like, well, we've been open about this, so we are setting up a plan B and a plan C where if we have to consider taking asylum somewhere,
Jesus.
well,
Yeah.
and it's like, okay, so I don't want to downplay the seriousness of it because I would never have expected friends of mine to say that they would want to seek asylum in that way. That was back what happened with Vietnam to go up to Canada. Now here we are in 2025, simply to raise your family, you have to think about doing it abroad. But yet I know that for the moment, those friends are still in America and they have not given up yet. Their plan A is still, we can make this a better place. And at state level, at local and state level, which we don't often pay attention to, there are a lot of those folks about.
Okay. Scott, thank you very much for sharing your insights on the focus.
Thank you,
From
John.
Thank you.
So I was going to say, stay safe, stay sane, all right?
Well, I'll try. I'm not sure I'm going to get there, but I'll try.
Right, okay.
From Ireland, that was journalist and associate of the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin, Emeritus Professor Scott Lucas. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Scott Lucas. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about Scott and to connect with him on social media. Now, on to questions for the audience. Do you believe Donald Trump's aggressive approach to trade and governance is a necessary correction to a broken system or a reckless dismantling of democratic norms and global stability? With allies like Australia, Canada, the UK, and the EU caught in the crosshairs of Trump's tariffs, should these nations push back more forcefully or bide their time and protect the broader alliance? Is the growing influence of non-elected figures like Elon Musk on American policy a sign of innovation and progress, or a troubling shift in how power and governance are reshaping the 21st century? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Auscast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section and I will do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producer of The Focus, Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.